The neon sign above the steel door buzzed like a dying insect, throwing a sickly red glow across the cracked asphalt. It had no business being beautiful. Nothing on this street did. But at 11:47 on a Thursday night in October, with the desert wind cutting through the industrial district of San Bernardino, like a blade, that buzzing red light was the most beautiful thing Carrie Dalton had seen in 3 weeks. She stood at the mouth of the alley and did not move. Her denim jacket was thin, the kind of thin that had been acceptable in September and was now in the grip of a California autumn that nobody warned you about, entirely inadequate. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not from cold alone, but from the particular posture of a woman who had learned over 5 years of marriage to Warren Holt that making herself smaller was sometimes the only armor available. $22. That was what she had. $22, a change of clothes in a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and a prepaid phone with 11% battery and no one left to call. She had burned through 3 motels in 3 weeks. Cash only always. First, a place off the 215 that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes, where she scrubbed the bathroom floor for a reduction in rent the manager never actually honored. Then a room above a roadside diner in Colton, washing dishes in the kitchen for $12 an hour under the table, sleeping on a mattress that sloped toward the wall. Then nothing. The Colton job dried up the same day she spotted the car parked outside for the second time in a row, a silver Nissan with rental plates and a man behind the wheel who was not looking at his phone. She had walked out the back and kept walking. Warren Holt did not forgive. This was not a character flaw he tried to hide. He advertised it. He had told her on their wedding night, with the particular calm of a man who considered himself a gift to the world, that loyalty was the only currency he respected. And disloyalty, he had said while straightening his cuffs in the mirror, was something he addressed personally. He was a city councilman, 18 months from a mayoral run that every political analyst in San Bernardino County considered inevitable. He had the police chief's personal cell number stored under a first name. He had a district judge who golfed at his club every second Sunday. He had a private investigator on retainer whose previous employer had been a federal agency that no longer officially existed. He had resources, he had patience, and he had told her the last night she spent in their house with his hand pressed flat against the wall beside her head that if she ever left, she would not get far enough to matter. She had left anyway. She had left on a Tuesday evening when he was at a campaign fundraiser across town, when the house was empty and the only sound was the refrigerator and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. She had taken the canvas bag from the back of the closet shelf where she had been quietly filling it over 3 weeks, a change of clothes, her social security card, the $40 she had been folding into the inner pocket, a few bills at a time from her personal account, before Warren reviewed the monthly statements. She had walked out the front door, which felt wrong because everything about leaving felt wrong in the specific way of doing the right thing at the wrong cost. She had walked 4 blocks to a bus stop and sat on the bench and waited and thought about nothing because thinking about anything was too expensive. The bus had taken her to San Bernardino because it was going there, and she was going away, and the distinction had felt sufficient at the time. 3 weeks later, $22 and a fading bruise below her left eye, she was standing at the end of a dead-end street, looking at a line of Harley-Davidsons, parked along the curb, like a row of resting predators, and a cinder block building painted entirely black, and a buzzing neon sign, and a piece of ripped cardboard taped to a reinforced steel door that said in thick black marker, "Bartender wanted. Keep your mouth shut or don't knock." Carrie read it twice. She had spent 3 days circling this neighborhood, not because she had been planning to come here specifically, but because the Iron Verdict MC's territory occupied 6 square blocks of the industrial district, and those 6 blocks were by general acknowledgement of everyone who lived and worked near them. The one pocket of San Bernardino that operated by its own internal law. She had heard this in a diner 2 miles east. She had heard it from a gas station attendant who said it matter-of-factly the way you describe the weather. She had done her research in the particular way of a woman who has learned that information is the only currency that cannot be taken away. She picked up her canvas bag, walked down the alley, and knocked. The sound that hit her when the door opened was almost physical. A wall of classic rock cigarette smoke stale beer, and raw leather. The jukebox in the far corner was playing something with a slide guitar and a man's voice that sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. The overhead lights were low and amber and did nothing to soften the edges of the room. There were approximately 30 men inside. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing. The pool cues paused, the glasses stopped halfway to mouths. The low conversations died. The only thing that kept moving was the jukebox grinding its way through the chorus of a song that nobody was listening to anymore. 30 pairs of eyes, most of them wearing leather cuts with patches that Carrie did not look at directly because she understood enough about the hierarchy stitched onto those backs to know that meeting them with the wrong energy was not an option she could afford. She looked straight ahead instead, at the bar, at the man sitting at its center. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way of men who spent their lives in gyms, but in the way of a man who had simply been built large and then spent 40 years adding density to the frame. His beard was thick and gray, shot through with remnants of a darker color. His arms resting on the bar were sleeved entirely in faded ink old work, the kind done in cramped spaces with questionable equipment, each piece bleeding slightly into the next. A scar ran from below his left ear down to his collarbone wide and settled the kind that had long since stopped being a story and become simply a feature of the landscape. The patch on the left side of his chest said President. Beneath it, a smaller patch said Rex. Everyone called him Grizzly. She had learned that from 3 days of careful listening in diners and gas stations within a 4-block radius. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected in a place where surprises are rarely welcome. Not with hostility, not yet. With assessment. The slow, unhurried kind that comes from decades of reading people in rooms where misreading them has consequences. "We're not a hotel," he said. His voice was exactly what his appearance suggested. Low and graveled and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need volume to fill a room. "And we don't run a shelter." "I'm not looking for either," Carrie said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. She was aware of her heartbeat in her throat, in her fingertips, in the specific patch of skin below her left eye, where the last of a bruise was fading through yellow into nothing. She had covered it with foundation that morning, standing in a gas station bathroom with a travel compact and bad lighting. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about her was perfect right now. But she kept her feet planted and her hands still and her eyes on the man at the bar. "Sign outside says you need a bartender," she said. "I pour fast, I don't short the till. I don't ask questions, and I don't flinch. You need someone who isn't afraid of the dark. I need a job. I think we can help each other." Silence. From the far end of the bar, a younger man pushed himself off the liquor cabinet he'd been leaning against and straightened to his full height. He was lean and broad-shouldered with the kind of stillness that didn't read as calm so much as coiled. His hair was dark cut short. His eyes were a pale, hard blue that caught the amber light and gave nothing back. The patch on his chest said Sergeant at Arms. His name tag stitched below the bottom rocker said Boone. "She's running," he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, just stating a fact for the record. "Trouble follows runners. We don't need outside heat." Carrie shifted her gaze to him. He was already watching her with the same clinical intensity he'd probably used to assess a structural problem, something that might hold or might not. "The trouble I'm running from," she said, "wears a suit and buys his police escorts. He won't step foot in a place like this. He's too careful about being seen in the wrong company. You give me the job I work, that's it. You won't know I'm here." Boone said nothing. His expression did not change. But his eyes moved to Grizzly, and something passed between the two men that Carrie could not read. Grizzly looked at her for a long time. Long enough that several of the men around the bar shifted weight on their stools or went back to their drinks out of boredom or discomfort. Grizzly did not seem to experience either. He simply looked at her with the patient thoroughness of a man who had learned that most problems announce themselves clearly if you gave them enough time to speak. He saw the exhaustion, the kind that lives beneath the skin after weeks of sleeping badly in strange rooms. He saw the deliberate steadiness in her posture, the effort it was costing her. And he saw what the foundation couldn't fully hide, the ghost of a mark below her left eye that told him something specific and concrete about the nature of the trouble she was running from. "Trial run," he said finally. He crushed a cigarette into a glass ashtray without looking at it. "You start now. Minimum wage cash under the table. You mess up a drink, you're out. You look at club business, you're out. You bring anybody to my door that I don't want here." He let the sentence end there. The implication was architectural. It held the room up. "Understood," Carrie said. She pulled off her jacket, set it in her canvas bag on the stool at the end of the bar, and walked directly behind the counter. The first thing she did was look at the layout. Speed rail on the left, well bottles in order of call frequency, backup stock visible through the gap below the counter. Draft handles in the center, 6 of them, too dark for light. Glass rack overhead, right hand. Ice bin with scoop left of center. She cataloged it in approximately 4 seconds, the way a person catalogs an emergency exit. The first time they enter a room, they're not sure they can trust. Then she picked up a bar rag, folded it over the pour spout of the closest bottle, and looked up at the nearest man at the bar. "What are you drinking?" she asked. The night began. What followed was not graceful. It was not supposed to be. The orders came fast, and they came without courtesy. Whiskey, neat, cheap, draft, double bourbon. Something called a rattlesnake that involved 3 ingredients she had to locate by scanning the bottles while her hands were already moving. The men tested her the way they tested everything in this room, with escalating pressure applied until something broke or proved it wouldn't. She did not break. A man they called Rucker slammed his empty glass down hard enough to crack the bar surface and demanded a refill with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. Carrie had the glass refilled and back in front of him before the sound had finished echoing, without comment and without hurry in her face, even though her hands were moving fast. Rucker looked at the glass, then at her, and picked it up without saying anything, which she was learning quickly was a form of approval in this room. Another man, a wall of a muscle with a shaved head and a road name she couldn't read from the angle, grabbed her wrist as she set a beer in front of him. Not hard, but firmly. The way you grab something to see if it will run. She didn't run. She looked at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face with the particular expression of a woman who has assessed threats for long enough to know the difference between a man testing a boundary and a man intending to cross one. This was the former. "You spill that beer," she said. "You're paying for it twice." He let go. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. He put a 50 on the bar and told her to keep the change. She pocketed it and kept moving. At the corner booth, half obscured by the low light, Grizzly watched. He had a fresh cigarette going and a glass of something brown that he was not drinking so much as holding. From this angle, he could see both the bar and the front door and the hallway to the back rooms, which was how he always sat, the positioning of a man who had learned early that comfort and visibility were rarely compatible and had chosen visibility every time. He watched the woman behind his bar move through the first hour of her shift. She was quick. Not performance quick, not the kind of quick designed to impress, but the deep functional efficiency that comes from doing something so many times the body takes over and the mind is free to do other work. She remembered orders. She didn't double pour. She kept the surface clean without being told, wiping down automatically between serves the way experienced bartenders do the motion, so ingrained it happens without conscious instruction. But the thing he noticed most was not her speed or her accuracy, it was her eyes. She tracked the room the way a sailor tracks the horizon. Not anxiously, not with the darting hypervigilance of someone expecting attack. With the settled comprehensive awareness of someone who has learned that knowing where everything is costs less than being surprised. She always knew where the door was. She always knew which conversations had shifted in temperature. She always knew without looking directly where the men around her were and what they were doing. He recognized it because he had spent 30 years building the same thing in himself. At some point after midnight, Boone had closed the distance to the far end of the bar and was leaning there ostensibly watching the room, actually watching the woman behind the counter. Grizzly caught his eye across the space and gave a nearly imperceptible nod toward the bar. Boone's expression did not change, but he straightened and went back to his circuit of the room, which was for Boone Mercer the closest thing to a concession Grizzly had seen him make in 11 years. The weeks that followed had a particular texture, not comfortable, not safe exactly, but structured. And after 3 weeks of living in the formless anxiety of motels and borrowed spaces, and the constant low-grade terror of not knowing if the car behind you on the highway was following, or coincidental structure felt like something close to oxygen. The iron verdict. MC operated by rules that were never written down and never needed to be because they were enforced by consequences rather than documentation. She learned them by observation and by the occasional sharp correction when she got them wrong. Fully patched members got served before prospects. Always. Not because prospects were unimportant, they were in fact required to be everywhere and do everything, but because the hierarchy was the architecture of the whole enterprise, and the bar was one of the places where that architecture was most visible. She got it wrong once in the first week, reflexively reaching for the nearest glass to fill, rather than reading the patches first, and a man called Decker turned from his stool and looked at her with an expression that communicated volumes without words. She adjusted. She never got it wrong again. Got it. When the men filed into the back room for church, their formal close meetings, she was to turn up the jukebox to a specific volume lock, the front door from the inside, and clean the bar without looking toward the hallway. The back room was soundproofed in the particular way of a place that had invested real money in the project. She heard nothing from it, and she didn't try to. She did not ask about what happened in there. She did not ask about anything she wasn't directly involved in. When conversation stopped as she approached, she went in a different direction. When things arrived in black bags through the back delivery door after hours, she took inventory of the liquor she'd already inventoried and kept her eyes on her clipboard. The men were not warm to her. Not in the first week, not in the second. Warmth was not a currency this room traded in. But they were gradually something adjacent to it. Predictable. She learned their orders and their hours and their moods, and the way each man's energy shifted when something was wrong versus when something was merely inconvenient. She learned that Rucker got quiet before he got loud, which was useful warning. She learned that a man called Freight always ordered a second drink exactly 12 minutes after the first, never sooner, never later, and that if he didn't, something was wrong with his night and you left him alone. She learned that the prospects, the young men running themselves ragged for the chance to be considered, were the most dangerous people to overserve because their need to prove themselves tended to escalate in direct proportion to their blood alcohol content. She poured fast and she poured fair, and she kept her mouth shut. Boone Mercer remained her most persistent problem. Not because he was hostile. Hostility she could work with, hostility was legible. Boone was something harder to navigate. He was watchful in the way of a man who had been given responsibility for the safety of everything in a room and who took that responsibility with the seriousness of a vocation. He did not like variables. She was a variable. 3 times in the first 2 weeks, she registered his presence without him announcing it. The first time was a Thursday night when a man she didn't recognize came in. Not a member, not a known associate, and sat at the end of the bar and ordered a beer and looked at her in the particular way that has nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with calculation. She kept her face neutral and her hands busy and mentally identified the heaviest item within reach, which was a full bottle of Maker's Mark. She didn't need it. Boone had closed the distance without sound 2 feet from the stranger. Now one hand loose at his side, his body communicating the full range of potential consequences without a single word being spoken. The stranger finished his beer in 3 minutes and left. Boone went back to wherever he'd been. He said nothing to her about it. The second time was a Friday afternoon when a delivery came in short, 2 cases of bourbon on the invoice that weren't on the truck. The driver was new and defensive, and the interaction had the potential to escalate. She handled it herself, calmly and completely documenting the discrepancy, getting the driver's information, notifying the supplier directly, and securing a commitment for the correction within 48 hours. When she looked up, Boone was at the end of the hall watching. He disappeared before she could say anything, and she understood that this too was a form of assessment, and that she had passed it, and that passing it was more valuable than any acknowledgement would have been. The third time was late on a Tuesday after close, when she had stayed to restock and had ended up sitting on an overturned crate in the storage room at 3 in the morning, head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. Not asleep, but not entirely awake. The suspended state that comes from a body that has been running on insufficient sleep and too much adrenaline for too many weeks and has simply decided to rest regardless of circumstances. She heard the storage room door. She didn't open her eyes. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a doorway that is not empty. Then the soft displacement of air near her shoulder. Then the slight weight of something laid across her arms. She opened her eyes. A plain canvas work jacket, the one that hung on the hook inside the storage room door, was folded across her lap. The doorway was empty. The hallway was empty. Somewhere in the main bar, the back door opened and closed with the sound of someone who was neither trying to be heard nor trying not to be. She sat with the jacket across her arms and looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she pulled it tighter and closed her eyes again. It was during the fourth week that Grizzly told her the truth. Not all of it. The whole truth, she would understand later, was being given in the pieces a person can actually use, the way you give directions to someone who is still moving rather than someone who is standing still. But enough of it. The part she needed right then. It was after the last patron had left, after Boone had done his final sweep and gone, after the jukebox had been switched off and the overhead light behind the bar had been dimmed to its lowest setting. Grizzly was still on his stool with a glass of bullet bourbon, not his first, but far from enough to matter for a man his size. Carrie was wiping down the counter in the automatic way she had developed over 4 weeks of closing shifts, the rag moving in long, even strokes from one end to the other, her hands not needing her attention. He didn't preface it. He just started talking. "I know Warren Holt," he said. "Not personally, by work." She stopped wiping. She didn't turn around. "He pushed the rezoning on East Side 2 years ago. There was a community center over there, 30 years old. After-school programs, recovery meetings, a food bank that ran out of a back room on Saturdays." He took a drink, set the glass down carefully. "My brother ran the recovery meetings, 11 years sober. He built that program from 4 people in a storage closet to 63 people on a Tuesday night." Carrie turned around slowly. Grizzly was looking at the glass in his hand, at the way the low amber light moved through the bourbon. Warren's donors wanted the land, strip mall and a parking structure. Warren made the calls that needed to be made, and the zoning went through in 6 weeks. The center closed in November. My brother lasted 4 months after that. A pause. He didn't make it to spring. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a truck was moving through the industrial district, its engine a low diminishing rumble. "I want to be clear with you about something," Grizzly said. And now he did look at her with the direct and uncomplicated gaze of a man who considered dishonesty a form of disrespect. "I didn't take you on out of charity. I'm not in the charity business. I took you on because you walked through that door asking for work, not for protection. You had nothing, and you didn't ask for anything except the chance to earn your place." He picked up the glass again. "That's something I respect, and you showed up at the right time in the right place for reasons that have nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the fact that men like Warren Holt eventually create the conditions for their own reckoning." Carrie looked at him for a long moment. "You're waiting for something," she said. It wasn't a question. Grizzly smiled. It was small and unhurried, the smile of a man who had learned that patience was not the absence of action, but the most disciplined form of it. "Everything comes around," he said, "if you're still enough to let it." She thought about that for the rest of the night. She thought about it while she finished closing down the bar and walked the 4 blocks to her rented room and lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around her. She thought about the way he had said it, without urgency, without theater. The patience of a man who had been still long enough for the world to come to him. She was not used to patience being a form of power. Warren had always used her urgency against her. The urgency to smooth things over, to de-escalate, to find the version of events that let everyone walk away without catastrophe. He had understood from the early months of their marriage that her instinct toward resolution could be exploited as reliably as a structural weakness in a load-bearing wall. Apply pressure at the right point, and she would move to fill the gap before she thought clearly about whether filling it was in her interest. She had learned slowly and at significant cost to stop moving reflexively, to stay still and let the picture complete itself before she responded to it. Grizzly was teaching her the same discipline in a different language. It was on the last Thursday of the month at the end of the fourth week that she saw the surveillance car for the first time. She noticed it because she had developed over 5 years of marriage to a man who believed monitoring was a form of care, a sensitivity to vehicles that were parked where they had no clear reason to be. The sedan was silver, a mid-range domestic model designed to be unremarkable. It was parked on the opposite side of the dead-end street, angled so that the driver had a direct sight line to the Iron Verdict's front door. The first night she cataloged it and said nothing. The second night it was back, different license plate, same vehicle, she was nearly certain different plates, which was not something a person did with a car they were parking in a convenient spot. The third night she watched the driver through the dark glass for long enough to understand that he was not looking at his phone, not eating, not doing anything that would explain a man sitting in a parked car on a dead-end industrial street at 11:30 on a weeknight, except the one thing that did explain it. She went back inside and finished her shift. She did not tell Grizzly. Not yet. She needed to be certain, and certainty in this particular matter was not something she could afford to get wrong. A false alarm was a cost she didn't want to pay. Not here, not with these men, not when the credibility she had built over 4 weeks was the only capital she had. But she knew what the silver sedan meant. Warren had always been a man of his word. She had understood even as she was walking out of that house on a Tuesday evening with a canvas bag and $40 and the particular calm of a person who has decided that the cost of staying has finally exceeded the cost of leaving, that he would not accept it. The private investigator, the police chief's direct line, the patience of a man who considered losing a category error rather than a possibility. She had bought herself 4 weeks. She did not know how many she had left. She stood behind the bar on that fourth Thursday night and moved her hands through the familiar work of pouring and wiping and stacking, and the work moved through her the way repetitive physical labor does when you have done it long enough to stop needing to think about it, leaving the mind free to run its own separate calculations. She had $22 when she walked through that door. She had 4 weeks of cash now. Not enough to run far, but enough to matter. She had a room that Warren's investigator had probably found, which meant that address was already compromised. She had a job that existed in the one geographic corner of San Bernardino that Warren Holt, for all his connections and carefully maintained relationships, did not have the standing to reach into cleanly. And she had, though she would not yet have used the word for it, something else. Something she had not had in a long time. A room where she knew where all the doors were, where she understood the people around her well enough to predict them, where the large man at the end of the bar was watching for things she couldn't see yet, and the quiet man in the leather cut was watching the room so that she didn't have to watch it alone, and neither of them had asked her for anything except her work and her silence, and her willingness to learn the grammar of a place that was nothing like any room she had lived in before. It wasn't safety. She understood that clearly. These men were not safe. The room she was standing in was not safe in any conventional sense of the word, but it was hers in the way that a foxhole belongs to the person in it. And that she was discovering was a form of protection that no restraining order and no sympathetic social worker and no police report filed 3 times and acted on 0 times had ever managed to give her. She poured a draft and set it on the bar without spilling a drop. Outside on the dead-end street, a silver sedan sat in the dark with its engine off, and a man behind the wheel who was earning his money. She picked up the rag and started on the next section of bar. She would deal with what was coming when it came. The 5th week began on a Monday with a specific wrongness in the air that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Not dramatically wrong, Not the kind of wrong that arrives with noise and broken glass. The quiet atmospheric kind, the change in pressure you register before the weather breaks, the particular weight of a room that has recently held something it is not disclosing. She felt it when she unlocked the front door at 4 in the afternoon and stepped into the dark before hitting the lights. The room smelled the same, old wood and stale beer, and the mineral desert air that found its way through every sealed surface. Everything was where it should be. Stools up on the bar jukebox, dark pool tables undisturbed. But something had happened here recently. She knew it the way she had learned to know things in this room by texture, rather than evidence by the quality of what the space was not saying. She went behind the bar, took down the stools, ran the glass rinser, and started the opening routine. An hour later, Ledger Pruitt came through the front door with his cut on and his eyes moving too fast. He was 23 years old, and he carried the specific combination of bravado and fragility that she had come to associate with young men who had grown up with a great deal to prove and not enough time yet to understand what they were actually proving it for. He sat at the far end of the bar and ordered a Coke he didn't touch, turning the glass in slow circles on the wood. Carrie let him sit. She had learned this. The men in this room did not respond to being approached. They responded to the presence of someone available to be approached. The distinction was everything, and it was entirely apparent to people who spent their lives reading rooms for safety margins. She restocked the speed rail, checked the draft pressure on the center handles, refolded the bar rags into thirds, a habit she'd built because it gave her hands something to do that didn't look like waiting. After 11 minutes, Ledger said, "You ever feel like you made a mistake you can't unfeel?" "Most days," Carrie said. He looked up. Something shifted in his face, the particular relief of a person who expected judgment and received none. "I've got a problem," he said. "I can see that," she said. "You want to tell me about it, or you want to keep turning that glass?" He stopped turning the glass. He opened his mouth, and then the back delivery door came in off its frame. Not a knock, not a rattle. The impact of a large boot applied with force and urgency to a door not designed for that purpose. Carrie had the heavy end of the Maker's Mark bottle in her hand before she had consciously decided to pick it up, which told her something important about what 4 weeks in this room had done to her reflexes. Ledger Pruitt came through the opening at a dead run. Not the Ledger who had been sitting at the bar. A different version of him entirely. Soaked through from the rain that had apparently started in the last hour, blood running freely from a gash above his left eyebrow, one hand locked around the strap of a heavy black canvas duffel that he was carrying against his body with the grip of someone who has been told that letting go is not an option. He saw Carrie. His face did something complicated. "Carrie," he said, "I messed up." She set the bottle down, came around the end of the bar, looked at the gash clean and deep enough to bleed, but not deep enough for stitches if the bleeding slowed, which it needed to do. Looked at the duffel fallen slightly open against the shelf leg, the gap in the canvas showing matte black steel and the unmistakable geometry of a magazine housing. She had grown up in a house where her father kept a hunting rifle in the hall closet and cleaned it on Sunday mornings the way other men read the newspaper. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She also knew what it meant that Ledger Pruitt, a prospect who was not supposed to be carrying this particular kind of material, was standing soaking wet and bleeding in the club's back room at 9 in the evening. "Talk," she said. "Fast." The words came out of him in a compressed rush. Transport job, Highway 9, Wretch Canyon turnoff. The Viper Kings had known the route and the time. The ambush had scattered everyone. Ledger had had the bag. He'd gotten out, but they'd gotten his plates, and he'd driven 40 minutes trying to lose the tail, and he couldn't go to any of the regular spots because Grizzly would find out about the burn route. And then Wyatt, he said, meaning Boone would, he stopped himself. "Where are they now?" Carrie said. "2 minutes behind me, maybe less." She looked at the bag. She looked at Ledger. She looked at the space around her with the inventory scan she'd built over 5 weeks of working a room that required you to know exactly what was where at all times. "Bag behind the kegs," she said. "Back left corner, empty kegs. Stack 2 in front of it." Ledger moved. "You're cut. Take it off." I'm not Ledger. Her voice dropped to the register that bypasses argument. The cut comes off, hooked behind the bottom shelf back of the storage unit, not visible from the door. Now. He peeled the leather off and hung it. Spare apron, second shelf. Put it on. An apron. You're a barback. You've been mopping up a spill for the last 20 minutes. There's a mop in the corner and there's water near the drain from a partial keg I bled off an hour ago. Get the mop into the water and start moving it. He stared at her for half a second that felt much longer. Then he got the mop. Carrie picked up her inventory clipboard from its shelf and positioned herself in the center of the storage room between the door and the back shelving, and she drew one slow breath from the bottom of her lungs, and she waited. The boot hit the door 40 seconds later. It held because it was locked. A fist followed, then again harder. Carrie walked to the door and opened it. 3 men, soaked like Ledger but larger, wearing green and black, the Viper King's colors she had identified during her 3 days of neighborhood research. Road grime on their boots and hands and faces. The lead man's right hand rested on the butt of a pistol at his hip, with the casual precision of someone communicating a range of options rather than committing to a specific one. Carrie looked at his boots, then up at his face. "You're tracking mud onto a floor I just had cleaned," she said. The tone was not afraid and not aggressive. It was the voice of a woman who has been interrupted in the middle of work. She was already irritated about being interrupted by people who are making the irritation worse. She had learned over 5 years of managing an unstable and volatile man, the single most disarming register available. The lead man stared at her. His hand stayed on his hip. "Kid on a Harley came down this alley," he said. "We want what he's carrying." Carrie shifted the clipboard to her hip and looked at him with the expression of someone running a rapid and unflattering assessment. "This is a delivery entrance," she said, "for deliveries, which we had one of 3 hours ago. The only other thing that came through here tonight was a stray cat that knocked over a full case of Modelo, which is what my barback has been cleaning up." She gestured behind her without looking away from his face. Behind her, the sound of a wet mop working against concrete. "If you want a drink, the front door is on the street. If you're looking for someone, I don't know what you're talking about. And if you're planning on standing in my stockroom much longer, you should know that Grizzly Callahan is 45 seconds away, and Boone Mercer is 30 feet behind me in the main bar." She let the names land. She had calculated them carefully, not as threats exactly, as keys. There were doors you opened with force and doors you opened with the right combination, and she had spent 5 weeks learning precisely which names in this world functioned as master keys. The 3 men exchanged a look, the kind that carries an entire conversation in less than a second between people with enough shared history to communicate without language. The lead man's hand moved fractionally away from his hip. "This ain't over," he said. "I didn't say it was," Carrie replied. "I said it was over in this stockroom tonight. There's a difference. They left, slowly enough to preserve something. But they left, pulling the door shut behind them, with the deliberate care of men who wanted it, understood that the departure was their own choice." The sound of boots on wet alley gravel. 2 engines turning over, then moving away, then gone until the only sound was rain. Carrie stood in the center of the storage room. She set the clipboard on the nearest shelf because her hands needed somewhere to go. Ledger had stopped moving the mop. He was leaning against the wall with the color entirely gone from his face, in the way that happens when adrenaline runs out before the body has had time to prepare for its absence. "You saved my life," he said. "You don't know that yet," she said. "When Grizzly finds out about the burn route, the math might look different." "He's going to find out." "Yes, but not tonight, and not from me, and not with those men still in the area." She picked up the clipboard. "Clean up the blood on the floor before someone comes back here." She paused. "And Ledger." He looked up. "You kept the bag. You didn't lead them to a house. You made the right call under pressure. That matters." He looked at her with the expression of a young man who had prepared himself for something much harder and received something he didn't know how to account for yet. Then he bent down and started wiping the floor. When Carrie walked back into the main bar, Boone was at the counter, standing both forearms on the bar surface, a cigarette going between his fingers, watching the doorway she had just come through, with the expression he brought to everything, which was to say no particular expression at all, just the full and undivided weight of his attention. She had assumed he was somewhere in the back of the room. He was not somewhere in the back of the room. He had been here close to this wall for some time. The wall between the storage room and the hallway was not thick, and the bar had been quiet tonight, with the rain keeping foot traffic down, and Boone Mercer was a man who had spent years training himself to hear things that other people's ears smoothed into background. She met his eyes. He reached under the bar and came up with 2 glasses and a bottle of top-shelf bourbon he had clearly already located before she came through the door. He poured 2 fingers into each glass and slid one across the polished wood toward her. He picked up his own glass. He looked at her with the pale blue eyes she had spent 5 weeks attempting to read and mostly failing, and then for the first time since she had walked through the front door on a Thursday night in October, with $22 in a canvas bag and a bruise she had tried to cover with bad lighting and worse foundation, Boone Mercer smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had held a standard in his mind and had just watched it get met in a way he had not entirely anticipated, and who respected the meeting of it more than he'd expected to. "Newest prospect," he said quietly. He drank. Carrie picked up her glass and drank and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The bourbon was good, genuinely good, the kind of good she hadn't experienced since before Warren had decided that her drinking habits were among the many aspects of her life that required his management. She let it sit for a moment, and then she set the glass down and picked up a bar rag and went back to work. She did not tell Boone about the bag. He did not ask. This was the grammar of this place. Things known and things not discussed, the line between them, maintained by mutual agreement rather than policy. She was learning the language one exchange at a time, and what she was learning was that trust in this room was not declared. It was demonstrated, accumulated, and then quietly acknowledged without ceremony, and the quiet acknowledgement was more binding than any contract. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Spool came in. Spool was the club's digital infrastructure, a description that Grizzly never used but that captured precisely what the man did. He was narrow and wire-framed in his late 30s, with glasses that were slightly too large for his face, and the particular ability of technically focused people to make themselves functionally invisible in any room by the simple act of opening a laptop. He sat up at the corner table without being asked, and stayed there for 2 hours running through whatever he was running through, 3 empty coffee cups accumulating beside him, his headphones in. Then he pulled the headphones out and looked at Grizzly. "Got something," Spool said. Grizzly didn't look up from the paperwork in the back booth. "Talk." Spool talked. Carrie kept her hands moving behind the bar and her face entirely neutral. The room was quiet enough and Spool was focused enough on content that his volume management was poor and she heard every word. The phone recovered from the Viper Kings member detained after the Highway 9 incident had contained a series of incoming payments. Not through traceable channels. A layered transaction architecture, the kind requiring either serious technical sophistication or access to people who had it running from a shell company registered in Nevada through a wire transfer service in Phoenix, and arriving in an account linked to a prepaid card used by a senior Viper Kings member. The shell company's registered agent address was a law firm in downtown San Bernardino. The law firm had 4 partners. One of them had until 14 months ago been Warren Holt's personal attorney. He had resigned from that representation to join the law firm 6 months before Warren began his city council campaign. The payment amounts corresponded with specific dates. The first payment was 3 weeks after Carrie had started at the Iron Verdict. Spool pulled up the shell company registration on his screen and turned it toward Grizzly. Grizzly looked at it for a long time. Then he looked across the room and his eyes found Carrie behind the bar. She was wiping down the counter. She had been wiping the same section of counter for approximately 90 seconds. "Carrie," he said. She looked up. "Come here." She came around the bar and stood at the edge of the table. Spool turned the laptop so she could see the screen. She looked at the registration document. She looked at the law firm name. She looked at the payment dates and the amounts and the layered company structure that had been built to make this impossible to trace quickly. She had known Warren was looking for her. She had known about the investigator and the surveillance car and the 3 motels in 3 weeks. She had understood that his resources were significant and his patience was calculated and his need to retrieve her was about control rather than love. Had never been about love, had always been about the specific intolerance of a man who considered any outcome he did not engineer to be a malfunction that required correction. What she had not understood until this moment was the full scale of what he was willing to construct. He was not simply looking for her. He was applying coordinated pressure to the structure around her. The Viper Kings were not an incidental complication. They were a tool. Warren Holt, who attended planning commission meetings and shook hands with the police chief at charity dinners and spoke at civic functions about the importance of community safety, had reached across the line separating his world from this one and contracted with men wearing green and black cuts to conduct ongoing surveillance of an outlaw motorcycle club's operations, to wait for the right moment to apply the right kind of heat, to create a situation in which the iron verdict became untenable as a location for Carrie without Warren ever needing to appear directly. He was patient and precise, and he was very, very skilled at destroying things without leaving fingerprints on the wreckage. She looked at the screen for a long moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the payment structure," Spool said, pushing his glasses up. "About an hour. The law firm connection 40 minutes. I'm still building the full picture." "Keep building," Grizzly said. Spool put his headphones back in. Grizzly looked at Carrie. He had the quality and moments of significant information of a man who considered silence to be the first and most important response, the way a careful person reads a situation before they speak into it. "This changes things," he said. "Yes," she said. "How do you want to handle it?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not the precursor to a decision already made. He was asking because the answer belonged to her, and he understood that without needing it explained. She thought about it for a moment. "I need to know the full scope," she said. "Not just the payments. What he knows about the club's schedule, what he thinks he can use and when he thinks he can use it." Grizzly nodded toward Spool's back. "That's what he's working on." "I want everything he finds," she said. "You'll have it." She went back behind the bar. That night she stayed late after close, not from exhaustion, but from the particular sleeplessness that arrives when a problem has revealed a dimension you didn't know it had. She sat on the overturned crate in the storage room, the one that had become her thinking place over 3 weeks of late nights, and she ran through everything from the beginning. Warren had resources she had always known about. The investigator, the police relationships, the money. What she was only now understanding was that his reach extended across lines she had assumed would limit him. He had hired Viper Kings. He had built a shell company to pay them. He had constructed a mechanism designed to dismantle the one place she had found where his direct authority didn't apply. But there was something he could not have accounted for. Every calculation Warren had ever made about her was built on a single foundational assumption that she was alone. He had spent 5 years ensuring this was true, systematically cutting her off from friendships and family connections with the patient precision of a man who understood that isolation was the load-bearing wall of control. Remove the relationships, remove the options, remove the alternatives, and the person has nowhere to go and nothing to leverage. She was not isolated anymore. She was behind the bar of a room that Warren was afraid to walk into directly. She had people around her who were watching for things she couldn't yet see. And now she had information. Spool's information. The shell company and the law firm and the payment dates and the full picture that was still being assembled. Information was leverage. She had not had leverage in 5 years. She stayed on the crate until the thinking stopped circling and started moving in a direction, and then she went to bed. 2 weeks after Spool's discovery, the envelope appeared. She found it on a Tuesday morning at the beginning of the 3rd week of November, tucked under the edge of the back door when she arrived for the opening shift. A plain white envelope with her name written on the front in handwriting. She recognized the way you recognize the specific smell of something that has frightened you before in the body before the mind catches up. She picked it up. Inside was a photograph, 8 by 10 professional print quality. It showed her asleep in her rented room 6 blocks away, visible through the window at street level, taken with a telephoto lens in the early morning when the gap in the curtain was at its widest. She was asleep. Someone had been standing outside her window in the dark, in the cold, for long enough to compose and take a clean, well-lit photograph of her sleeping. Behind the photograph was a single unlined sheet of paper. The handwriting was Warren's, the same hand she had read across grocery lists and birthday cards, and the notes he left on the kitchen counter that looked like reminders and functioned as warnings. It said, "I won't come into that place, but I'll be waiting when you come out." Carrie stood in the alley behind the iron verdict with the photograph and the note and the envelope. And the San Bernardino morning came in cold off the desert, and somewhere 3 blocks over, a truck was backing up with its reversing alarm going, and everything in every direction was entirely ordinary. She read the note again. She looked at the photograph. She thought about the investigator finding her new address, an address she had given to no one. She thought about 7 nights of standing outside her window in the dark. She thought about the careful, deliberate construction of a message designed to communicate one specific thing, that there was no wall she could put between herself and his attention, that the iron verdict was a bar and not a fortress, that she would have to come out eventually. Something in her, the part that had been running on compressed survival instinct for 5.5 weeks without break, reached the end of its fuel. Not fear. She was past fear. Something specific and different from fear. The exhaustion of being the source of other people's danger. The particular weight of knowing that by staying here, she was not protecting herself so much as importing a threat into a place that had offered her something real, and that the men around her who had given her work and grammar, and the canvas jacket on the crate, and 2 fingers of top-shelf bourbon, did not deserve to absorb the cost of Warren's obsession with controlling her. She went inside. She found paper behind the bar. She wrote 4 sentences. She folded the paper and left it under the register where Grizzly would find it when he opened. She got her canvas bag from under the counter. She walked to the back door. She put her hand on the door handle. "Don't!" She did not turn around. The voice was behind her, not close, not threatening, carrying the specific quality of economy that belonged to a man who said the minimum necessary and meant every syllable of it. Boone was in the hallway. She didn't know how he'd gotten into the building. The doors had been locked. It was possible he'd never left. It was possible he'd seen her arrive, and something in the set of her shoulders and the direction of her walking had told him things his years of reading rooms had taught him to recognize. "I'm pulling this in here," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Everything I've built in 5 weeks, that's nothing compared to what it costs if Warren keeps working the angles. He found my room address. He's been watching me sleep. He has resources I can't match and connections I can't block, and he is not going to stop Boone. He's never going to stop. And the Vipers are already—" "Grizzly knows," Boone said. She went quiet. "He's known since this first week. Not the specifics, not the shell company spool found that, but the shape of it, what Warren Holt is capable of and what he's likely to do." A brief pause. "Grizzly doesn't take things on that he hasn't thought all the way through. That applies to situations. It applies to people, too." She stood at the door with her hand still on the handle. "He's not going to let you walk out of here alone at 5 in the morning, Boone said. He wasn't going to let you do that on the first night. He's not going to let you do it now." The morning air was cold through the thin gap at the door's edge. She could feel it on her hand. She thought about the trial run and the 4 weeks that followed, the hierarchy she had learned and the silences she had honored, and the clipboard and the apron and the 3 Viper Kings who had left the building because she had known which names functioned as keys. She thought about the canvas jacket across her arms in the dark, and the 2 glasses of bourbon on the bar, and the small, dangerous smile of a man telling her she had earned something she hadn't known she was being evaluated for. She thought about what it meant to choose to stay, not because she had run out of options, Not because she was too tired to keep running, but because she was choosing this room and the people in it with both feet, instead of keeping one always pointed at the exit. She took her hand off the door handle. She turned around. Boone was standing in the hallway, 6 feet back, arms at his sides, his face communicating what it always communicated, which was nothing overt and everything essential. He looked at her with the pale, direct eyes and said nothing else because nothing else needed saying. She set the canvas bag down on the floor. The note he left, she said. The photograph. There's metadata in the image file. I need Spool to look at something. Boone nodded once. She went back to the bar. The 11th week arrived without announcement. Carrie had been at the Iron Verdict for 76 days. She knew the number the way a navigator knows distance, not from sentiment, but from the practical necessity of understanding where you are when the terrain is unfamiliar and the destination is uncertain. 76 days of under-the-table cash in closing routines and opening procedures. 76 days of sleeping 6 blocks away with a chair wedged under the door handle and a notepad under the mattress for license plates. Spool had spent the 2 weeks since the envelope working with the focused intensity of a man who considered incomplete information to be an unacceptable condition. He had built the picture layer by layer, the shell company chain connecting Nevada to Phoenix to the Viper Kings account. The investigator Warren had retained, whose digital trail Spool had followed through 3 private security firms to a name on a Riverside County courthouse filing. The surveillance photograph metadata, which told them not just that someone had been outside Carrie's window, but exactly when, for how long, and on how many separate occasions. 7 times in 11 days. Warren had been having her photographed through her window for 11 days before he sent the envelope. He had been building a file of a sleeping woman. The purpose of such a file was not obscure to anyone who understood how Warren Holt operated. Grizzly had read Spool's full report on a Thursday morning, the reading glasses he wore in private, and never acknowledged in public on his face the paper spread across the back booth. He read it twice, folded the glasses, put them in his breast pocket, looked at the table for a moment in the silence of a man who has received information that confirms something he already understood and is determining what to do with the confirmation. Then he made 3 phone calls. Carrie did not ask about the calls. She had learned the grammar of this place thoroughly enough to understand that some information was given when it was needed, and asking for it before then was a cost she didn't need to pay. On Friday morning, Grizzly told her that the club's regular Tuesday schedule had been adjusted, that he would be out of the building during the hours when the surveillance pattern suggested Warren typically received his investigators' reports, that the front door would be unlocked, that the bar would be running a reduced crew. He said this plainly without emphasis or theater, the way he communicated everything as information she was entitled to because it belonged to her situation. She looked at him across the bar. "You're making a window," she said. "I'm adjusting a schedule," he said, for him to walk through. Grizzly picked up his coffee. A man like Warren Holt doesn't move until he thinks the conditions are exactly right. He's been building conditions for 11 weeks. The most efficient thing we can do is let him believe they are. She understood then. Not a trap in the crude physical sense. Something more precise. An invitation written in the language Warren spoke fluently, the language of surveillance and intelligence, and the careful orchestration of circumstances. He had been watching. They had let him watch. And what he had seen, what his investigator had reported, was a schedule disruption and a reduced crew, and a woman who had nearly walked out the back door on a Tuesday morning, an event that Spool had subsequently confirmed the investigator had documented and transmitted. Warren thought the window was open. Warren was wrong about the temperature of the room he was preparing to walk into. But he was coming. She knew this with the particular certainty that comes from 11 weeks of living inside the decision architecture of a specific mind. He would receive the report on Monday. He would analyze the window. He would calculate that the disrupted schedule meant Grizzly was occupied, that the reduced crew made the room manageable, that Carrie's near departure indicated fracturing resolve. He would put on a suit because he always wore a suit to confrontations, because the suit was part of the argument, and he would come himself because retrieving her was personal and he would not trust anyone else to understand the nuances of how he needed it done. He would walk in believing he was taking an opportunity. He was walking into a room that had been waiting for him since the first week. Carrie spent the weekend on regular shifts, not thinking about Tuesday, in the way that you avoid thinking about something by occupying every adjacent thought. On Monday night, she sat on her crate in the storage room for the last time and looked at everything around her. The keg stack where Ledger's bag had been hidden, the hook behind the bottom shelf, the drain she had cleaned 100 times, the inventory clipboard. She thought about the woman who had stood in this room 11 weeks ago with a bottle in her hand and 3 armed men at the door, and nothing between her and a very bad outcome, except the specific quality of stillness that 5 years of living with Warren Holt had, as an unintended consequence, constructed in her. He had been trying to build compliance. He had been trying to build the reflexive smallness that made a person easy to control. What he had actually built through 5 years of consistent and calculated pressure was something he had not planned for and would not have chosen. He had built someone who did not flinch. She looked at the storage room for another moment. Then she went to bed. Tuesday arrived gray and pressureless, the kind of Southern California winter day that settles for overcast because it can't commit to rain. Carrie opened the bar at noon. Ledger was there running supplies from the back, moving with the quiet purpose of a young man who has recalibrated something important about what it means to owe someone. Spool was at the corner table by 12:30, headphones and laptop open. Decker and Freight were at the pool table, a game that had been going since before Carrie arrived and would probably continue until the bar closed, neither man particularly invested in the score. The bar felt exactly like what it was supposed to feel like. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the front door opened. Warren Holt stepped inside. He was precisely as she remembered him, and precisely as she had been not allowing herself to remember him, which were the same thing. Charcoal suit with a fine chalk stripe, the kind that cost more than 3 months of her wages at the iron verdict. Leather-soled shoes that announced each step against the floorboards. Dark hair precisely cut. The architectural certainty of a man who paid serious money to appear effortless. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the low amber light. Then he found her behind the bar, and he crossed the room toward her, and she watched him move through the space the way Warren always moved through spaces he considered beneath him, with the particular, careful non-contact of a man concerned about transfer. Looking at the scarred wood and the neon signs and the pool table in the back, where Decker and Freight had paused their game, and were watching him with the patient, uncommitted attention of men who had seen many things walk through that door and knew most of them resolved themselves. He stopped at the bar. Up close, she could see the slight tension in his jaw. The specific postural set she recognized as managed aggression, the controlled energy of a man holding his adrenaline on a short leash. He had told himself a story about this moment. She could read it in every line of how he was holding himself, and the story involved him walking in and her walking out with him, and the whole episode being resolved by the sheer weight of his presence and his certainty and the 5 years of psychological architecture he had built inside her. He had been telling himself that story for 11 weeks. Did you really think? Warren set his voice in the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable and menacing. Simultaneously, the range developed across years of city council sessions and closed-door conversations where people needed to understand something without being told it explicitly that this was going to work, Carrie. She looked at him. She let the silence sit for a moment, the way Grizzly lets silences sit, because silence is the first and most important response, and she had finally, after 5 years of being trained to fill every gap before it could be used against her, learned to use it. "You look tired, Warren," she said. His jaw tightened. He had not prepared for that. "I'm not here to discuss how I look," he said. "I'm here because this has gone on long enough. You've made your point. I understand you were upset. We can discuss adjustments, changes, whatever it is you need to hear." His voice dropped fractionally toward the register that always preceded the transition from negotiation to something else. "But you are going to walk out of this bar with me today. I have a campaign event on Friday, and you are going to be standing next to me when I take that stage, and this entire episode is going to look exactly like what we're going to say it was. A wife who needed space and a husband who gave it to her. No, Carrie said. One word. Clean flat without qualification or apology. Warren's expression did something complex. The negotiating face tried to hold, but something harder was pressing through it. The thing beneath the suit, in the managed voice. The thing she had spent 5 years learning the exact shape and weight and temperature of. Carrie, he said. I heard you, she said. The answer is still no. He leaned forward and put both hands on the bar, the leather of his watch clicking against the oak, and his voice dropped to the register he used for the moments when the performance had run its course. You have no idea, he said quietly, what I can do to this place. One call, one anonymous tip to the right desk at the right agency. I have a city councilman's credibility, a relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the complete willingness to use both. I will have everything in this building buried under federal paperwork before the week is out, and I will make certain you're standing in the middle of it when that happens. That's interesting, said a voice from the back of the room. Warren straightened and turned. Grizzly was walking out of the hallway that led to the back rooms. Plain flannel shirt and work boots, moving with the unhurried ground-covering stride of a large man who has nowhere urgent to be because he is already exactly where he intended to be. Behind him, Decker and Freight had left the pool table and were standing at the edge of the room, not close, not aggressive, simply present in the way of men who are available if availability becomes necessary. In the corner, Spool had closed his laptop and removed his headphones. Ledger had come through from the back and was standing behind the bar to Carrie's left, with the stillness of a young man who understands the weight of a room and is choosing to carry his portion of it. Warren looked at all of this. She watched the recalculation move across his face, the rapid reassessment as the room resolved into something entirely different from what his investigators' reports had described. Not a depleted crew, not a disrupted schedule leaving a vulnerable window. A room that had been arranged. A room that had been waiting for him specifically and had been waiting for some time. Councilman Warren Holt, Grizzly said, stopping 10 feet away and crossing his arms. Not a fighting posture, but an observing one. The posture of a man who has already assessed the situation and found it entirely as expected. I know exactly who you are. I've known for a while. The East Side rezoning, the community center, the shell company in Nevada running payments through your former attorney's law firm to the Viper Kings. He tilted his head slightly. You want to discuss phone calls to federal agencies, we can absolutely do that. Spool. Spool opened the laptop. Warren's eyes moved to the corner. 3 weeks ago, Spool said without looking up from the screen, I started assembling a file. Payment records from the Nevada Shell Company to the Viper Kings, cross-referenced with specific dates of surveillance activity against this location. Text messages from a phone registered to your campaign committee to a number associated with your former attorney discussing the timeline for resolving, I believe you used the phrase, the logistics problem. He pushed his glasses up his nose. The logistics problem being Carrie. Warren said nothing. His face had done something she had never seen it do in 5 years of marriage. It had gone completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his presentation. The involuntary stillness of a processor that has received information incompatible with its operating model and has not yet resolved the conflict. You also kept records, Grizzly continued, which is genuinely interesting. Spool found a backed-up cloud folder linked to your personal email account. Photographs, dated, organized, systematic, going back considerably further than the 3 weeks Carrie has been working here. He looked at Warren with the expression of a man who has spent 4 decades forming precise opinions about people and has formed one now that is not subject to revision. You kept them because you believed they gave you something. You were right about that. They do give somebody something, just not you. Carrie came out from behind the bar. She had spent considerable time in the weeks since the envelope thinking about what this moment would feel like. She had expected something dramatic. rage or triumph, or the complicated grief of confronting the full architecture of something you survived and are still in the process of understanding. She had braced for it. What she felt was none of those things. She felt clear. The specific clarity of air after a long rain has moved through and taken everything unnecessary with it. Not emptiness, precision. The feeling of a room where the furniture has been moved and you can finally see the actual dimensions of the walls. She stopped 6 feet from Warren and looked at him. Not up the way she had looked at him for 5 years, with the particular angle of someone who has been made to feel that their perspective requires permission. Level. The way you look at something you have assessed completely and understand without residue. You came here to take me back, she said. You spent 11 weeks building the conditions for it. You paid for surveillance. You hired intermediaries. You constructed a file of evidence you thought gave you control. She paused for one beat. I've been building a file too. She walked to the corner table. Spool turned the laptop to face outward. The screen showed an email composition window. The recipient fields were filled. FBI Criminal Division, Los Angeles Field Office. IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The San Bernardino Sun. The Los Angeles Times Regional Desk. And a name she recognized as the investigative reporter who had been circling Warren's campaign finances for 6 months without quite enough material to publish. The email had been composed over 2 weeks methodically and completely the way Carrie had been doing everything for 11 weeks. Payment records, shell company documentation, the full Viper Kings connection with transaction records, the surveillance photographs from outside her window, time-stamped, geolocated, attached as evidence of criminal stalking under California Penal Code 646.9. The cloud folder from Warren's personal account obtained through means Spool had not elaborated on and that Carrie had decided not to ask about. In the bottom right corner of the email window, a sent timestamp. She let Warren look at it. That went out 17 minutes before you walked through the door, she said. Warren looked at the timestamp. He looked at it for a long time. She watched it move across his face. Not dramatically. The way water moves through sand, slowly and completely changing the composition of everything it passes through. The understanding that he had walked into this room believing he was the one holding leverage and had discovered that the leverage had never been his. That the window he had identified had been held open for him. That the 11 weeks of patient surveillance and orchestrated pressure, every careful move he had made, had been from a certain angle exactly what she and Grizzly and Spool had needed him to spend building, because everything he built had become material. His face without the suit's authority, and the managed voice and the performance of a powerful man in command of a room was simply a face. Older than she remembered. Tighter around the eyes and mouth. The face of a man who had invested so comprehensively in the management of his own appearance that the thing underneath had never been given the conditions to develop into anything worth looking at. She felt no pity. She had expected some residue of the 5 years, some involuntary softness toward a person she had once loved or had once believed she loved, which was a distinction she no longer had the energy to parse. There was none. What was there instead was the clean, factual recognition of something that had ended as complete and final, as a door closing on a room you are not going back to. You have options, Grizzly said from behind her, his voice carrying the flat, practical quality of a man discussing logistics. You can stay here and let us walk you through what the next several months of your life look like in some detail. Or you can walk out that door right now and find an attorney, preferably one whose relationship with you doesn't already constitute a conspiracy charge, and start making decisions about how you want to navigate what's coming. Warren looked at Grizzly, then back at Carrie. The files are sent, Carrie said. There's nothing left to negotiate about what happens to them. They exist. They're already where they're going. What you do from this moment forward is your decision. It doesn't change what's already in motion. You understand what this means, Warren said. His voice had changed entirely. The last register. The one underneath everything else. The one she had heard rarely in 5 years, usually at the end of nights, when the performance had fully exhausted itself, and it had always been the most frightening version because it was the actual one, and the actual one had capabilities the performance version kept contained. I understand exactly what it means, she said. My career is a matter for the FBI and the IRS and two newspapers now, she said. That's not something I did to you, Warren. That's something you built. I just found it and showed people where it was. The room was very quiet. From outside, through the thick cinder block walls, the sounds of the street arrived faint and ordinary. A truck, wind off the desert moving down the alley, the world continuing its business at a distance. Warren Holt stood in the bar for another moment, his hands at his sides, his suit still precise, the chalk stripes still straight, the leather shoes still catching what dim light reached the floor. Everything about his exterior still performing its function, still presenting the version of him he had spent decades constructing and maintaining. But his eyes had stopped. No calculation, no inventory of angles and contingencies, no rapid assessment of options, just the flat spent recognition of a man who has arrived at the end of a road he built himself and found nothing waiting there, no exit, no continuation, nothing but the end. He turned. He walked to the door. His hand pushed it open. The gray Tuesday afternoon light came in for a moment flat and cold, and then the door swung shut behind him and the room returned to its amber dimness, and Carrie stood in the center of it and took one long, slow breath. She heard his footsteps on the pavement outside, the specific click of leather soles deliberate and unhurried, because even now, even walking out of the room where his entire structure had just been comprehensively dismantled, Warren Holt was not going to be seen to hurry. The performance persisted even when the stage was empty. Then the footsteps stopped. A voice she didn't recognize, professional and flat, carrying the particular compressed authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without discussion. Then Warren's voice stripped down to something she had never heard from him before. Something beneath every layer, just the raw, unmanaged material of a person encountering a consequence they cannot negotiate with. Then nothing. Boone had moved to the high interior window on the east wall, the slit of glass near the ceiling that looked out at an angle toward the street. He was standing on the rung of a bar stool, looking through it with the same expression he brought to everything. Two, he said. Suits, federal plates on the vehicle. Grizzly looked across at Spool. Spool had sent an additional communication the previous week, separate from the newspapers and the federal agencies, to a contact whose name and institutional affiliation he had not shared with Carrie. The response had come back in under 4 hours, which told her something about the nature of the relationship and the quality of what Spool had offered in exchange. They've been outside for 40 minutes, Spool said. He closed the laptop. Carrie stood in the center of the Iron Verdict bar. She thought about a parking lot, a diner in Colton, a gas station bathroom with a travel compact and inadequate lighting. 3 weeks of rooms with sloping mattresses and scrub floors, and the specific kind of fear that lives in the body as a permanent low-grade vibration present in every waking moment, and most sleeping ones until you can no longer remember what it felt like to exist without it. She thought about a reinforced steel door and a buzzing red neon sign and a piece of cardboard with black marker. She thought about $22. The weight that had been sitting in her chest for 5 years, the physical and specific weight of a life lived in permanent anticipatory fear, was gone, not reduced, not managed into a smaller version of itself. Gone the way a fever breaks completely and without ceremony, leaving behind something clean and ordinary and entirely itself. She picked up the bar rag. She started wiping down the bar. Behind her, the room resumed itself. Decker and Freight went back to the pool table. The crack of the break, the low roll of balls across, felt. Ledger ran glasses through the rinser with the focused efficiency of a young man who has somewhere to be and something to do and understands the value of both. Spool opened his laptop and put his headphones back in. Grizzly settled onto a stool at the center of the bar, in his spot, the one that let him see the room and the door and the hallway simultaneously. He picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Boone came around and leaned against the back of the bar in his usual position, and the room arranged itself around him the way it always did. And Carrie moved through it the way she had learned to move through it, with the specific, settled purpose of someone who is exactly where they have chosen to be. She thought about what came next. Not in the immediate weeks ahead, not the federal case being built, or the newspapers running their first stories, or Warren's campaign collapsing in the particular public way of things constructed on concealed structural failures quickly and completely, and without the dignity of a gradual decline. She thought about what came after all of that, what came next for her. She thought about a place with good light, a bar she'd built herself, not someone else's bar, where she'd been given a trial run, but something that started from her own dimensions. Something that smelled like wood and coffee in the morning, and something warmer in the evening. A place where she knew the regulars and they knew her, and the whole operation ran on the specific mutual trust of people who found each other by accident and decided to stay on purpose. She could see it clearly. She had learned something in 11 weeks inside a cinder block building painted black in the industrial district of San Bernardino that she had not expected to learn and could not have found anywhere else. She had learned that the difference between a woman who is trapped and a woman who is free is not the circumstances around her. It is not the resources available or the connections or the geographic distance from the source of the danger. It is a specific moment when she stops waiting for someone else to open the door and understands completely and without reservation that she is the one who decides when to walk through it. She wrung out the rag. She started on the next section of bar. 2 years later, the place was called Dalton's. Not a creative name, an honest one. And honesty had become her primary design principle in the period following everything that had happened in those 11 weeks, because she had spent 5 years surrounded by beautiful dishonesty and knew exactly what it cost. It was on the east side of San Bernardino, not the industrial district. Somewhere quieter. A low building set back from the road with a gravel lot and a hand-painted wooden sign that caught the afternoon light in a way she hadn't planned for, but had come to rely on the way you rely on something that turned out better than you intended. The bar was oak. She had built most of it herself, with Ledger handling the heavy structural work and a carpenter named Gus doing the finish work at a price Grizzly had arranged by the simple mechanism of sending her to him, because Grizzly's referrals came with expectations attached on both sides, and everyone involved understood this without it needing to be discussed. The interior was not beautiful in the conventional sense. The walls had the particular quality of a space that had been worked rather than decorated, the kind of texture that accumulates through use rather than intention. She had not tried to make it pretty. She had tried to make it honest, and honest had turned out to have its own aesthetic, plain and specific and entirely itself. Warren Holt was in federal custody, had been for 14 months awaiting trial on 6 counts, including wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and criminal conspiracy. His bail application had been denied twice on the grounds of flight risk, which was the court's way of acknowledging that a man with offshore accounts and foreign contacts was not a man whose commitment to appearing for his own trial should be taken on faith. His fourth attorney since the arrest had indicated to the press that a plea agreement was under active discussion, which meant the case against him was considerably worse than the public filing suggested, and Warren had concluded that trial would be worse still. The newspapers had run their stories thoroughly, and over time, each new filing generating a new round of coverage that added detail to the picture. The IRS had run its own investigation, which had uncovered material the original filing hadn't included. The Viper Kings connection had generated a separate criminal referral that had resulted in charges against 4 members of the organization's senior leadership, and had as a secondary consequence significantly diminished the club's operational capacity across 3 counties. None of this had required Carrie to appear in a courtroom yet. The documentation Spool had assembled had been sufficient for the federal investigation to develop its own parallel evidence through legitimate channels, and her attorney, a woman in Riverside who specialized in cases involving the intersection of domestic abuse and financial coercion, had guided the dissolution of the marriage with the efficient precision of someone who had done it many times and understood which elements required the client's direct presence and which did not. The marriage was legally ended. The estate, which Warren had fully expected to protect through the same mechanisms that had protected everything else he owned, had become the subject of civil forfeiture proceedings. Her attorney had been creative and persistent and very skilled at her work. Carrie was not wealthy. She was free, which was something she had not been for 5 years, and which turned out, having actually experienced its sustained absence, to be worth considerably more than wealth and not remotely comparable to it. On Friday mornings, Boone Mercer sat at the far end of the bar at Dalton's and drank black coffee and said approximately as many words as he said anywhere, which was not many, but which she had learned to read with the fluency that comes from sustained attention. He had come on the second Friday after she opened, then the third, and at some point she had stopped noting which Friday it was and simply set the cup at the end of the bar when she heard his truck turn into the gravel lot. Grizzly came on Sunday afternoons. He took the corner booth and worked through the print edition of the regional newspaper, reading it with the same comprehensive thoroughness he brought to everything, annotating the margins in the shorthand she had seen on paperwork in the back booth at the Iron Verdict and wisely never asked about. He drank bullet bourbon and tipped in cash. On his way out each Sunday, he paused at the bar and said something brief and specific that functioned simultaneously as assessment and approval. And then he left, and she understood that this was how he expressed affection, and she received it as such. Ledger came irregularly, the way young men come to places they genuinely like, in bursts and gaps, governed by whatever the week had been, usually with another patch member in tow. Usually on Thursday evenings, when the week had accumulated enough weight to make a familiar room feel like a reasonable destination. He had his full patch. He wore it with the particular combination of pride and self-consciousness of someone who has earned something real and is still in the ongoing process of believing they deserve to. The bar filled in the evenings with people who had no connection to the Iron Verdict or anything it represented. Regulars from the neighborhood, workers from the light industrial area east of the lot, a group of retired men who played dominoes at the corner table on Tuesday and Thursday nights with the devoted consistency of people for whom the ritual itself is the point. A woman who taught at the elementary school 3 blocks over and came in on Fridays for a glass of red wine and stayed 2 hours reading, which Carrie had initially assumed was a performance of solitude and had eventually understood was a genuine preference that she respected completely. They were not outlaws. They were not brothers in any formal or codified sense. They were people who had found a room with honest light in an honest bar, and a woman behind the counter who remembered their orders and didn't ask questions they hadn't first invited. They came back. On a Wednesday evening in late November, 2 years and 1 month after she had stood in an alley in the industrial district of San Bernardino with $22 in a canvas bag and a bruise she tried to conceal with bad lighting and worse foundation, and knocked on a reinforced steel door. Carrie closed Dalton's at 11, ran the final numbers, wiped down the oak bar she had built with her own hands, and turned off the lights. She stood in the dark for a moment. The bar smelled like wood and bourbon and the particular warmth that accumulates in a room that has held people in it all evening. Outside, the San Bernardino night was cold and clear, the desert cold that stripped the sky clean and made the stars hard and close and very bright. She thought about a woman standing in an alley with nothing but the decision to knock. She thought about what it had cost to get from there to here. Not just the 11 weeks at the Iron Verdict, not just the federal case and the dissolution in the slow, careful, deliberate construction of a life that belonged entirely to her. All of it. Everything before. The 5 years of a marriage that had been designed to make her smaller and had, through some fundamental miscalculation on Warren's part, done precisely the opposite. There are men who build walls around things they cannot control, she thought, and call the walls protection, and believe the story because they need to. They are very good at it. They are patient and they are precise, and they understand correctly that isolation is the foundation, and that a person without alternatives is a person who will stay. What they do not account for is the possibility that the person inside the walls might spend 5 years studying the architecture, learning every weakness, memorizing every stone, not planning to tear it down, just understanding it completely. Because a wall you understand completely is not a prison. It is a blueprint, and a blueprint in the right hands is a door. She locked the front door of Dalton's. She walked to her truck in the gravel lot. Above the entrance, the hand-painted wooden sign caught the last of the parking lot light, plain and simple, and entirely itself. Dalton's. She got in the truck and drove home through the clear November dark, and the stars were very bright, and the heater came on after a minute, and the road ahead was empty, and the night was hers in the specific and irreducible way that things are yours when you have understood completely and without reservation that you earn them.